Setting up a diet can be a daunting task. With so many variables to consider and so much misinformation and disinformation flooding the internet, it's hard to find good and reliable sources of information on how to set up a diet, and it's even harder to actually put it in practice. And over all the years I've been going to the gym and coaching clients, I've seen the negative impacts that the industry has had on individuals time and time again. Whether it be not having the right information leading to poor results, not having enough money to afford a nutritionist, or just the sheer frustration that's brought on by misinformation in the industry, causing so many individuals to just give up on their goals. And since I used to be obese and went through my own weight loss journey, I figured I'd make a complete guide on how to set up your own diet using evidence-based principles that worked for me and works for all my clients. So before we get into the more complex topics, let's first understand the basics, like how does weight loss actually occur? Well, to put it simply, in order to increase or decrease fat mass, in general, you must be in an energy surplus or an energy deficit, since fat mass is your body's way of storing excess energy for later use, with a few caveats such as body recomposition, which is a topic for another video. So, as I assume we all know, the unit of energy for the body is known as a capital C calorie, or kilocalorie. And in order to be in an energy deficit, you must burn more energy or calories than you eat throughout the day. So, to illustrate this, think of your body as a bank account. Every time you deposit money or intake energy, you are consuming food worth that many dollars or calories. And every time you withdraw money or burn energy, that's you expending calories via metabolic processes like breathing, walking, maintaining posture, exercise, etc. So to keep this simple, let's say your bank account has a $100,000 balance. And let's say on average every day you withdraw $2,500 from your account to pay for bills or whatever other expenses you may have, which is what's known as your total daily energy expenditure. In this scenario, you will need to deposit over $2,500 every day on average for your account to grow or increase your fat stores. And if on average you deposit less than $2,500 a day, your balance decreases, aka you use your fat stores as energy for metabolic processes, which is more or less the same way our body actually works, with a few extra complications I'll get into later. Now, sticking with our bank account analogy, in order to figure out how much money you spend every day on average, you'll need to find something that's known as your total daily energy expenditure, which is the sum of all your metabolic processes, namely your basal metabolic rate, which is how many calories your body burns if it did nothing all day but exist, as well as your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is how many calories you burn doing activity that isn't formal exercise. So stuff like walking, fidgeting, maintaining upright posture, etc. And we also have the thermic effect of food, which is how many calories you burn actually digesting and absorbing the food you eat. And lastly, your exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just how many calories you burn during formal exercise. Now, the numbers on the screen are a general rough estimate of what makes up the average person's total daily energy expenditure. However, it's very individual depending on the person. For example, I get around 15,000 steps a day on average, and when I'm not out walking, I'm always fidgeting. So my NEAT likely makes up a significantly greater percentage of my total daily energy expenditure than most individuals. Not only that, your TDEE is constantly changing day to day, and that's why we typically use daily average estimates. And it's also why it's a smart idea to adjust your diet over time, which I'll talk more about later. Now, with all that information in mind, your next question would probably be, how do I find my average total daily energy expenditure in order to set and adjust calorie targets to reach my goals? And well, there are three general ways to find your TDEE and set your daily energy intake level, which have actually been covered pretty in depth by Eric Trexler on the Stronger by Science website. So I'll go over the three ways here, and if you want a more in-depth understanding, I'll link that article below. So the three methods are to assume, estimate, or observe. And starting with the assume method, which is the quickest method, but also the least accurate method, however still useful since for the average individual, it's a rough estimate that seems to work a decent degree most of the time. All you need to do is follow a simple calorie per pound of body weight weight calculation depending on your goal. But again, you should keep in mind that these equations aren't an exact science, and as Eric Trexler states in his article, those assumed energy intake values will probably get you within striking distance of the correct intake, but they're obviously basic, imprecise, and ultimately imperfect. So instead, you may want to use a more individualized and likely slightly more accurate approach that's still pretty easy, such as the estimate method. So the estimate method starts with you using an equation to get an approximation of your basal metabolic rate. There are a few equations out there, and some are better for certain populations in comparison to others. So it may be best to use all these equations and take an average value to lower the chance of getting an outlier BMR. And once you have your BMR, you simply multiply it by an activity coefficient in an attempt to accurately portray the other components of your daily energy expenditure. And for those of you who aren't as confident in your math capabilities, you may use a calculator that does all of this for you. I'll be sure to link one in the description that has been pretty accurate for me and my clients in the past to make things simple for you. However, I will mention that it tends to be quite inaccurate if you have a very significant amount of muscle mass and or are an extremely active individual. However, lucky for you, only a very small fraction of the population will actually be in this category. Now, luckily, if you're very honest about your characteristics and activity level, this method should get most of you in a very close approximation of your true average total daily energy expenditure. And eating that exact number daily should theoretically keep you within the weight maintenance zone. And if your goal is to lose weight, you'd either want to multiply your estimated total daily energy expenditure by 0.8 to 0.9 in order to get yourself into an approximate 10 to 20% calorie deficit. Or you can just decrease your calorie intake by 250 to 750 calories for a nice, slow to moderate weight loss phase. And if your goal is to go on a more aggressive weight loss approach for quicker results, you can instead either multiply your estimated TDEE by 0.6 to 0.7 for a 30 to 40% energy deficit, or again, simply decrease your calorie intake by 750 to around maybe 1,000 or 1,250 calories from your estimated TDEE. However, I'd like to mention that this is, again, a very aggressive approach, and without proper behavioral change and habit formation, this may be too hard a deficit to maintain. And if you find that it isn't too difficult and you do actually achieve your goal quickly, it is still possible that you might rebound after the diet, since you haven't taken any steps to make sustainable lifestyle changes from the lifestyle that got you overweight in the first place. But lucky for you, I will be covering good behavioral changes in my next weight loss video to help maintain the results you work so hard for, so make sure to keep your eyes peeled for that video that should be coming out in the near future. And now that we're done with the estimate approach, let's move on to my personal favorite approach and the most accurate approach, since it allows you to update your calorie target based on whatever metabolic changes may be occurring week to week, which is to observe. Now, in order to observe, you'll have to accurately measure your body weight daily, as well as accurately track your daily intake, or at least as accurately track it as is feasible for you. Then, after a few weeks of tracking all these values, you'll find the weekly averages of your weight and energy intake to see which way your weight is trending towards with the average calorie intake you've been consuming. Now, I'd like to also mention that the assume, estimate, and observe methods aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I actually recommend that you use the estimate approach first to find a ballpark estimate of your TDEE, and then begin observing your weight changes in relation to hitting the calorie goals you set using the estimate approach. So when it comes to tracking energy intake, I always recommend my clients get a food scale as well as some measuring cups in order to gain some experience with rigidly tracking their food and help them build a general sense of being able to eyeball how many calories a meal contains depending on the ingredients and the portion sizes. Then, after a few weeks, we decide to either switch to a more loose tracking approach or not. However, I will like to mention that I've anecdotally observed more success and more freedom with a more rigid tracking approach coupled with a more flexible calorie goal. For example, I rigidly track my nutrition and body weight daily, but I don't have a rigid calorie or macro target. And typically when I'm in a weight loss phase, I would be in a 1,000 calorie deficit. However, if I don't reach that deficit, I don't consider it to be a diet failure. I just consider it to be a longer journey. And as for the body weight tracking, I always recommend that my clients weigh themselves either in the nude or in underwear every morning after using the washroom and before drinking or eating anything. Now, for some people, the observe approach is easy, and for others, it's very hard. So for that reason, I'd like to mention that if you are going to do the observe approach, you should make sure that you are able to emotionally distance yourself from the number on the scale. Your self-worth and confidence should not be linked to a number on the scale. And I want you to understand that you will sometimes see very large fluctuations in your scale weight on a daily basis. But I want you to also understand that the accrual or loss of fat mass or muscle mass isn't the only number that affects the number on the scale. Scales weigh the sum of your entire body's weight. This means that yes, it does weigh fat and can be a helpful tool to determine if you're losing fat mass if used properly. However, it also weighs in things like water retention, muscle mass, and gastrointestinal waste, among tons of other factors. And in most cases, your daily weight on the scale means absolutely nothing and therefore has no value when used in solitude, which is actually why this method requires you to weigh yourself daily, or at the very least, weigh yourself most days of the week. The reason we record these daily values is not to use the daily value alone, but to add all the daily values of a given week and calculate your average weight along with your average daily energy intake in order to see which direction your weight is trending towards with the daily calorie target you're reaching. Now, if your goal is to lose weight with this method, you can either use the same deficit approach used for the estimate method once you find your maintenance calories, or you can instead shoot for a certain rate of weekly weight loss. For example, aiming to lose 1% of your weight per week, or aiming to lose around 1 to 2 pounds per week. This method is slightly quicker because it allows you to lose weight without finding your maintenance calories first. However, if you use this method along with a food tracking or diet app like MacroFactor, for example, the app will, over time, calculate your maintenance for you using your characteristic data as well as your daily weigh-ins and your calorie intake data, which will eventually be helpful to you once you finish your diet and will want to immediately jump your calories back up to a maintenance level. So now that we know how to track and how to set up calorie goals, the next step is figuring out your macro and micronutrient goals in order to optimize health outcomes, retain or build lean muscle mass, stay satiated, and overall just feel better throughout the diet. So starting with protein, being the recovery nutrient, protein is an essential nutrient for everyone and especially for people with positive body composition goals. The benefits of a high protein diet are many and varied, whether it's to facilitate recovery, build or retain lean mass, enhance satiety, etc. Protein will always be a must for any diet. But when it comes to protein, what are some practical guidelines to follow for the benefits associated with it? Well, to get the practical rules, first you have to understand the basics. All proteins are made of amino acids, and there are 20 naturally occurring amino acids, 9 of which we can't synthesize on our own, meaning we have to get those 9 amino acids through foods we eat. These amino acids are known as essential amino acids since it's essential we eat them, and among these 9 amino acids, one particular amino acid called leucine is responsible for initiating muscle protein synthesis after a meal. And in order to build muscle, we must synthesize more protein than we break down. So if it isn't already obvious, essential amino acids are, well, essential. And following muscle protein synthesis after a meal, we experience a decrease in muscle protein synthesis and an increase in muscle protein breakdown. Therefore, if we theoretically want to take as much advantage of muscle protein synthesis as possible to support hypertrophy, we should theoretically aim for around 3 to 6 meals a day with roughly equal protein content per meal and containing plenty of essential amino acids. And if you're a meat eater, you're in luck because generally most animal-derived protein sources are a good source of amino acids and are considered a high quality protein. Whereas vegans watching this video will have to work a bit harder to find a mix of vegetables that offer good essential amino acid profiles, or they'll have to replace some of their protein feedings with vegan whey powder that has a good EAA profile. Other than that, however, a good general goal for leucine is to get around 2, maybe 3 grams per meal for fairly active individuals looking to maximize muscle gains. But now you may be wondering, how much protein do I need daily to optimize optimized results? Well, if your goal is to maintain or increase muscle mass while on a diet, the recommendations are pretty simple. Assuming you're fairly active, lift weights, and are between 10 to 20% body fat for males or 20 to 30% for females, your general recommendations to theoretically optimize results would be to get 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight daily. However, if you're active or intend to be active and are above 20% body fat for males or 30% for females, my recommendation would instead be to get 1 gram of protein per centimeter in height. And if you're active and are below 10% body fat for men and below 20% for females, I'd recommend getting something closer to 1.1 grams or even sometimes up to 1.2 or 1.3 grams of protein, depending on how active you are and how much muscle mass you're carrying on your frame. Of course, with higher activity and more muscle mass, meaning you should aim for the higher end of the recommended range. And lastly, I'd also like to mention that if you're on an extreme calorie deficit, you'll need more protein to maintain or gain muscle mass. Therefore, if you're on a large deficit, I almost always recommend going to or even exceeding the higher end of all my previous recommended protein ranges, since high protein intakes have no real downsides for healthy individuals with no pre-existing conditions that might limit their protein consumption. And for one example, I'm a moderately active individual with a good amount of muscle mass in a 1000 calorie deficit, and I shoot for around 3 grams per kilogram of lean body mass or 1.3 grams per centimeter in height, even though I might not need that much. And my reason for that is I view protein intake as more of a better to have and not need than to need and not have type of situation. So now that we're done with protein recommendations, it's on to fats. And fats, just like proteins, are an absolute must for your diet, since they're used for critical bodily functions like cell membrane construction, hormone production, and fat-soluble vitamin absorption. But again, the question that may be on your mind is, what are some general guidelines for fats that might help me know which type of fat to get in my diet and in what quantities? So let's briefly cover what kinds of fats there are and give you some general heuristics on how to apply the current evidence-based recommendations to your diet. Starting with the basics, we typically categorize dietary fats based on their hydrocarbon chain structure. And despite how complex and scientific that might sound, it's actually pretty simple. And as you can see here, saturated fats are, well, saturated, given their structure contains as many hydrogen atoms as possible and therefore are saturated with hydrogen. Whereas unsaturated fats contain either one double bond, which is known as the monounsaturated fat, or contain 2 or more double bonds and are known as polyunsaturated fats, given that they're not fully saturated with hydrogen. And, well, the main distinction between these two dietary fats when it comes to health is that we generally want to limit saturated fats to below 15% of our daily calorie allotment, given that saturated fats may be helpful in small quantities, but can also be harmful past that 15% threshold, which means that, unlike the advice most fitness gurus give you, it is recommended that you get saturated fats in your diet, but just don't exceed the upper limit, given that saturated fats aren't inherently harmful and the poison is always dependent on the dose. And when it comes to unsaturated fats, you generally want to fill the rest of your fat allotment with a mix of mono and polyunsaturated fats, given that they've been shown to lower LDL cholesterol, which is known as the bad cholesterol, which gives you a better HDL to LDL cholesterol ratio, which is in favor of HDL cholesterol, or the good cholesterol. And speaking of cholesterol, I'd also like to mention that there's no need to avoid foods with cholesterol, since cholesterol in food doesn't actually do much in ways of affecting our cholesterol levels. Now, I'd also like to mention that there's another category of fat known as trans fats, and are known as trans fats because, well, you guessed it, their hydrocarbon chain is slightly different than regular cis fats. As shown here, the functional groups of their double bonds are on opposing sides. Now, since trans fats seem to possess no specific nutritive benefit to us and actually seem to be quite deleterious to health outcomes, the typical recommendation for trans fats are to limit artificial trans fats as much as possible, with naturally occurring trans fats, however, such as the small quantities of trans fats found in meat and dairy products from ruminants, having inconclusive evidence. And we're not sure whether it's due to how small the quantities tend to be in these products or if there's a true difference in risk. So my general recommendation as of right now are that you don't need to worry too much about these naturally occurring trans fats so long as you eat a reasonable amount of these products, aka so long as you aren't on a cheese-only diet, you'll probably be fine. And lastly, again, much like protein, there are also essential and non-essential fatty acids. These two truly essential fatty acids are known as alpha-linoleic acid, or ALA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, and linoleic acid, which is an omega-6. So you'll generally want to supplement these fats or eat foods higher in these fats. However, I'd like to also mention that fats like EPA and DHA have been linked to positive impacts on things like cognition, mental health, inflammation, immunity, and plenty more. And while it's true that we can create EPA and DHA if our diets are high in ALA, these conversions are pretty inefficient, so I'd typically recommend either supplementing with algae oil or a fish oil supplement, or simply eating a serving of fatty fish, which is higher in EPA and DHA, rather than relying on your body to inefficiently create them, given that you want to actually reap the benefits of these fats. So, in conclusion, dietary fat is very important for overall health, and insufficient intakes can lead to harmful outcomes, and therefore, whenever you're on a weight loss diet, it's important to have a lower limit to fat intake in an attempt to ensure you're getting enough fats to ensure a healthy diet. But you also don't want so many fats that it detracts from the possible benefits that other nutrients may provide. So typically, evidence-based recommendations are to aim for getting around 20 to 35% of your total daily calorie intake from dietary fats. However, if you're on a very low calorie diet, this may be too few fats to support a healthy diet. Therefore, I very generally recommend your absolute lowest limit be 30 grams of fat daily, or if you'd like a more individual approach that might work better for you specifically, rather than a very general flat number, you can use this great formula, which again is provided by Eric Trexler in his Stronger by Science article about how to set up a diet. So big shout out to Eric. Then, once you have your dietary fat range, you'll want to try and get around 1/6 to 1/3 of those fats, or approximately 5 to 10% of your total daily energy value from saturated fats, with no more than an absolute upper limit of 12 to 15% of your diet coming from saturated fats. Then, the remaining 2/3 of your fat intake, or approximately 25 to 30% of your calorie intake, should come from an equal mix of mono and polyunsaturated fats, while limiting as many artificial trans fats as possible. However, since food labels are only required to list saturated and trans fats, you'll just have to count every other gram of fat in the food product that isn't saturated or trans as mono or polyunsaturated fats. Now, lastly, I'd recommend either supplementing algae or fish oil supplements, or eating at least one serving of fatty fish daily in order to ensure you get sufficient amounts of EPA and DHA through your diet for the extra benefits they may offer. So, moving on to carbohydrates. Unlike fats and proteins, carbs aren't an essential nutrient, meaning technically we don't really need them for survival, much if at all, in our diet. However, they do still play an important role in energy production for moderate to high intensity activity, whether it's cardio or resistance training, and therefore is an important nutrient in the diet for anyone looking to maximize performance. And not only that, there are still lots of health benefits associated with a wide variety of carbohydrate-rich foods, such as fruits and vegetables, which are typically high in fiber, vitamins, and minerals. So again, contrary to the recent hate and dietary advice a lot of health and fitness gurus preach, carbohydrates do still have a key role in the average diet and are even more critical for athletes who play one or more high-intensity sports. The two simplest ways to categorize carbohydrates are simple carbs and complex carbs, with simple carbs referring to sugars and complex carbs referring to starches and fibers. Now, my simple carb recommendations would typically be quite simple and sweet, but given that there has been a recent increase in the demonizing of certain carbohydrates, I figured I'd quickly go over some of the most discussed simple carbs, which are glucose, fructose, and sucrose. Sucrose, or table sugar, is composed of a 50-50 split of glucose and fructose. Now, glucose is a key energy source for our brains, and it provides the building blocks for starch and and glycogen. Fructose, however, has been recently demonized as the bad sugar, and people often recommend you avoid foods with a higher fructose to glucose ratio, or they'll just demonize sugars altogether as a bad nutrient. And while fructose doesn't have any special health benefits, it also doesn't really have any evidence supporting the recent demonization of it. To quote an excerpt from Eric Trexler's Stronger by Science article on setting up diets, glucose and fructose are simply metabolized a little bit differently in the body, and very high fructose intakes can have unfavorable effects on your liver and blood lipids. It's pretty tough to unintentionally get troubling amounts of fructose from eating whole fruits, but you can achieve some remarkably high intakes of fructose if you're consuming a lot of processed, hyper-palatable, high-calorie foods and beverages like soda, juice, and candy. So there is biochemical basis for some of the concerns related to fructose. But you don't have much to worry about if you're physically active, eating an appropriate amount of total energy, and eating a fairly balanced diet. In healthy, active, weight-stable people, even extremely high fructose intakes are pretty benign. Now, for fiber, the recommendations are thankfully pretty simple. The two common recommendations are either to scale fiber in relation to your calories, which is usually just to eat 12 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories in your diet, or to get anywhere from 30 to 50 grams of fiber daily. However, I'd like to mention that for some people, going towards that higher end of the fiber range may cause bloating or stool irregularities. So it's ultimately up to you to test between different fiber goals on the spectrum and find the sweet spot for you. And if you do get adequate fiber intake, it may favorably impact satiety, making your diet easier, as well as positively impact glycemic control, blood lipids, bowel movement regularity, as well as reduce risk of several cancers and chronic diseases. Now, my usual total carb recommendations are pretty simple. I typically just recommend you calculate your daily protein and fat ranges and fill the rest of your calories with carbs. For example, my protein range is 200 to 240 grams a day, and my fat range is 60 to 100 grams a day. Now, since protein is 4 calories per gram, this is the calorie range allotted to my protein goals, and since fat is 9 calories per gram, this is the calorie range allotted to my fat goals. And if you subtract those ranges from my theoretical 3,000 calorie allotment, it leaves me with this many calories available to be allotted to carbs. Now, since carbs are typically 4 calories per gram, it translates to this carb allotment. However, since most fibers are anywhere from almost 0 calories per gram to around 2 calories per gram, it can make tracking macros a bit more complicated, which is why I typically always recommend my clients get a diet tracking app like Macro Factor, which does cost money, but it thankfully is pretty cheap, and I personally believe it's one of the best apps currently on the market. And I believe it still comes with a free trial if you'd like to test it out first. Also, don't worry, I'm not sponsored or anything by Macro Factor, I'm just a fan of the app. However, if you'd like a free diet tracking app, I'm sure there are tons out there on the market, but they'll likely be less quick and easy to use. So moving on from typical carbs, we have one last nutrient to cover, which is alcohol. Now, alcohol is a pretty cut and dry topic when it comes to health and diet. Each gram of ethanol provides 7 calories and is, unsurprisingly, the least useful and least satiating nutrient. So you'll typically want to completely cut it from your diet. However, if you are an alcohol enthusiast, technically you still can consume alcohol and lose weight so long as it's within your calorie allotment. But I'd like to also mention that alcohol negatively impacts health even at low quantities, and when acutely consumed at moderate to high quantities, has been shown to negatively impact testosterone, sleep, and recovery. So even though you might still be losing weight while drinking alcohol, it may make it more likely that the weight you're losing will be lean mass instead of fat mass, which may result in either negative body composition outcomes or just worse outcomes than you would have previously gotten if you didn't drink any alcohol at all. So my recommendations are to completely cut out alcohol, or to at least limit your alcohol consumption to only a few beers per drinking session. Also, for you alcohol enthusiasts, I know I may be preaching to the wrong crowd here, but if you want to quit alcohol and are anxious of how your peers may react, I'd like to mention that everyone I know in my life that has quit alcohol has actually received a lot more positive support from their peers than they expected, unless, of course, they are in high school. And if you do receive some hate for it, you might want to reconsider your relationship with the person who directs that hate towards you, since typically your friends and family should be glad that you're trying to make a healthy life choice. But to each their own. So, moving on to our last topic of this video, we have micronutrients. Now, in order to not drag the video on too long, I'll have a super simple overview. This is a list of categories for micronutrients that will help guide you to the proper intakes. Generally, for people with no pre-existing health conditions that may affect your micronutrient consumption, you'll want to shoot for or slightly past the RDA for micronutrients. And if there is no RDA, the AI would be your next best bet. Now, when going above the RDA or AI, you'll also want to make sure that you are below the UL in order to reduce risk of any negative health effects, especially when consuming fat-soluble vitamins, since these are the easiest micronutrients to accidentally reach toxicity levels on. And if you're pushing your training really hard or consuming a low-calorie diet, you may want to get more iron, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and vitamin B12. Now, if you set up your diet using all of these general guidelines, I'm sure you'll eventually meet your physique and health-related goals. And until then, I hope you enjoy the journey along the way. What's going on, guys? Thank you so much for making it this far into the video. And I'd like to also thank the Mass and Stronger by Science team for making the creation of these videos a lot easier. And if you liked the video and enjoyed the information, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to support me and the creation of these videos. It would be very, very greatly appreciated, since it does take a while to gather all this information, check every source, and put it all together into a hopefully entertaining form. And with all that, I'll be seeing you guys in my next video. Peace.